everybody. Good evening. How nice to see so many of you here on a Monday. I'm Kate Pickett. I lead the Public Health and Society Research Group here at the University of York and the Born in Bradford Centre for Social Change. And I'm delighted that you've all joined us this evening to hear from Dr. Donnie Maclurcan, who is going to explore the hidden reasons post-growth futures must be post-capitalist. And this event is jointly hosted by the York Policy Engine, by the Social Change Catalyst, and by the Social Policy Research Unit in the School for Business and Society. So thank you to those groups for their sponsorship of the event tonight and for their organisational help. I'm really excited to hear from our speaker tonight, who is promising an experiential presentation where the diagnosis of what's problematic opens unexpected possibilities for systems change that can involve all of us. Donnie Maclurcan is Director of Strategy for the Post-Growth Institute, and we are really, really glad to welcome him here tonight. He has had the career of a polymath across more countries than I can count. And he founded the Post-Growth Institute in 2010, and his current professional focus is designing frameworks, methodologies and experiences for creative collaboration and collective liberation, along with an intuitive model for a post-capitalist market economy that builds on what's already working. Let's make the most of it and get started. Thank you.
This question here, I think you actually know the answer. And we're going to put that to the test. So you'll need a piece of paper, which I think most of you have. And we're going to start by writing the word future in the top. Well, first of all, draw a line vertically down the centre of your page. And then in the top right, write the word future and the word present in the top left. Okay. We're going to start on the right-hand side. I want you to imagine a future that is working for everyone and everything, human and non-human species alike. An economy that's working for everyone and everything. Just imagine that for a moment. And when you've connected with some kind of imagery, drop down into your body and feel it. How does it feel in that economy that's working for everyone and everything? And when you've connected with a feeling, with your eyes open, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen or pencil that represents how it feels in that economy. Draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen or pencil that represents how it feels in that economy. Now we're going to move to the left-hand side, the present. How does the present economy feel? And again, when you've connected to a feeling, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen or pencil that represents how the present economy feels. Okay. I've been conducting this experiment for 14 years all around the world with probably more than 10,000 people across every background I can imagine. I've done this with billionaires, I've done this with people living on the street, I've done this in languages other than English, I've done this with people who are very much for capitalism and people who are very much not for capitalism. And it doesn't matter who, where, or in what language I do this experiment, people consistently draw one of 5 symbols or shapes for the future and one of 5 symbols or shapes for the present, or a close variation or combination of those. So I'm going to show you what people around the world draw, and then you can see how that relates to what you drew. Here we go. For the future, people typically draw a circle, an infinity or panarchy symbol, a spiral, a nodular blob, or a heart. Hands up if you drew one of those or a close variation or combination of those. Just have a look around the room. Okay. And for the present, people typically draw a jagged line, an isosceles triangle, a downward arrow, a rectangle, or a mess of lines. Hands up if you drew one of those or a close variation, combination. Just have a look around again at the room. Okay. Normally I would give you a chance to unpack this, to work through the psychology of these things. But given the time constraints you have tonight, I just want to make some commentary on this. The primary difference that I see when we look across these two, that you might see as well, if you just take a moment to reflect, what do you see as the pattern differences? What I take away amongst many other things, but probably the most important for tonight's exploration, is the difference between the future being non-linear, symbology, and the present always having linearity. So even if you drew something a little different, have a look at what you drew and see if non-linearity shows up for the future and linearity for the present. If so, I would suggest this taps into something we know in our bodies. We know that all living systems thrive on non-linear circulation. Whether it's carbon or nitrogen cycles in our ecosystem, whether it's oxygen and blood in our bodies, we know that when things circulate, inherently, we have life. We know that when things stagnate, and when we have this ultimate stagnation and accumulation, there's that death that comes. In other words, our bodies know the importance of a system having circulation built in, not as an afterthought, but built in. In our societies, as human beings, I would suggest that there are three things that we require circulation around in particular. There's many more, of course, but these three fundamentals. The first is the circulation of materials. Now, many people here tonight, I imagine, work in environmental policy. Maybe some of you work on material flows or use words that I'm not familiar with in that kind of area. And that's important for sure. But a lot of the emphasis around ecology and economics and the intersection these days is focused on this circulation, right? The circular economy, for example, this kind of model. And I would suggest that, important as it is, there are things further upstream that affect this form of circulation more. One of those things upstream is the circulation of power. Who holds it, who wields it, etc. Who holds and wields power often influences the agendas around material flows. But there's something even further upstream than power. And it's interesting because in the 15 or 20 years that I've been working in this kind of field, so often there is a languaging of wealth inequality being central to some of our explorations. But I'm going to suggest that a more particular language is needed for us to unpack what's really going on in terms of the global situation. And that's the circulation of money. Actually, money, not wealth, not power, but money. This contrasts to what we have. So if we have a thriving system where all three of those things are interrelated and operating with inbuilt circulation, it contrasts our present situation that we're familiar with, this accumulation of materials that happens that's taking us towards a collapsing ecology, the accumulation of carbon, etc., nitrogen, other kinds of externalities, so to speak, that create all sorts of challenges that we're familiar with. We also have the accumulation of power that's familiar with our dominator culture, if I'm referring a little bit to the model that Riane Eisler refers to, partnership versus dominator. But interestingly, in my opinion, the linearity of our economy is primarily because of what happens with money. Most of the explorations I see around linear economy refer to material throughput, material use. Tonight, I'm talking about what happens with money, that it's at the heart of all that we need to unpack. Now, to understand why the global economic system has inbuilt monetary accumulation, or linearity, requires us to know two things and to do a little bit of an experiment here with some willing volunteers. we have to know how money and debt are actually created, including their relationship. Now, maybe some of you are already bristling at like these terms, money, debt. Oh, we're going into a territory that's not a space that feels comfortable for me, perhaps. That's great. It's welcome, because tonight what I'm going to try to do, and this is a little bold, is try to suggest that all of the conversations around money, debt, economic growth, etc., have been massively overcomplicated. Massively. And I'm going to suggest that there's a simpler way that we're going to see modeled here for us to all understand what's happening in terms of the growth imperative in our economy. So we need to know how money and debt are created. And some of you here may already have studied money and how money is created, etc. And I'm going to ask you to hold back your assessments of what you know, because I might be challenging some of them, even for those of you who've done deep dives, perhaps especially for those that have done deep dives into this. The headline being that I think most people who focus on money creation get things wrong. We also need to know what happens with money and debt in any capitalist system. Lots of different forms of capitalism. And what do I mean by capitalism? This is a definition I have that I created. It's that it's a primarily for-profit market system driven by the underlying principle of monetary accumulation into private individual hands. And these are very particular words I'm using. You'll see lots of different definitions of capitalism, and I think most of the definitions are very poor. Why? Because they talk about things that aren't necessarily specific to capitalism. For example, a market is not specific to capitalism. But here I'm talking about a for-profit market system. Those words come together. And in that case, it is unique to capitalism. So what I'm going to require is three volunteers tonight. The first volunteer I'm going to need is someone who is ready for some physical labor. It's going to require a little bit of strain on one's arm. So I'm wondering if anybody is willing to be my assistant, let's call you that. Anybody willing to help me out? You'll be up on stage maybe for about 5 or so minutes, 5-10 minutes. Who is willing to step into this role? Thank you, sir. The person behind actually is going to jump in. Let's go. Thank you. And I promise you this is all covered by the insurance of the university. And we're going to start by looking at how are money and debt created. Thank you. I'm Donnie, by the way.
I'm Josh.
Josh, thank you. Please make Josh welcome to the front of the stage. Josh will be giving the lecture afterwards on how I survived this. No, okay. All right, so how are money and debt created? Well, what we need to do first is I'm going to be the banker, Josh, and I'm going to use this to represent debt and this book's here to represent money, okay? Now, the first thing is that only, if we go back just a second here, if you had asked me this question about how is money created 10, 15 years ago, I mean, Josh, what would you have said? And no worries about getting it right or wrong. How do you think money's created? Who creates it, for example?
Just banks, I don't know.
Banks, right? Exactly, you're right. I used to think it was governments. It's not governments. If you hear someone say that governments print money, it's not true. Banks create money, only banks, and only two forms of banks, central banks or commercial banks. They create new money, so we're going to say, here's some money. So Josh is going to be representing a member of the public, all right, who's taking out a loan. So you've got some new money that is credited by a bank into your account. And when they do that, they always simultaneously create a new debt. You might have heard this expression that money is created out of thin air. Anyone heard that expression before? I think it's one of the worst, most deserving sentences that happens in progressive economics, because it gives people this idea that banks or whoever, someone, just gets to create money without any kind of obligation in the other side, which is the sentence needs to finish, money is created out of thin air alongside debt being created out of thin air, right? They balance each other out. And we know this if you take your debt here. Let's say Josh is wanting to buy a new vehicle. it costs, I don't know, 10,000 quid. And so it takes out a loan for 10,000. So you're going to have to hold these in separate hands just for the moment here. Takes out the loan for 10,000, so the money gets credited. We know that's going to now, by the way, that just was, yes, keystrokes that created that. Imagining we had £1 billion in the global money supply before this moment. We now have 1,010,000 in the global money supply. And imagine there was $1 billion of debt, of global stocks of debt. We now have 10,000 more debt, so 1,010,000 of debt. Why? Because this money that Joshua has been given now has to be matched by a debt that he owes the bank, right? This money, of course, is now going to go off somewhere to pay for something, and Josh has the debt, but also has the vehicle, right? Okay, that's our first part here. And how would these things, let's say, actually, if you hold them a little longer, just each hand in, let's say that 5 seconds after the loan was signed, Josh changed his mind. And there's a clause in the contract that says if you change your mind within an hour, you can cancel the contract. What that means is that this would happen. Any debt of any kind is removed from the global system when any form of loan is repaid. So in this case, let's say Josh decided, to keep it even for a day and then made $10,000 gambling and then had the money to pay off the loan and there was no interest at that point on the loan. All of a sudden, these two things connect and it disappears from the system. We are now back with, how much did I say, $1 billion, 100 billion, 10 billion, and the same amount of debt as before. So this money and debt that was here, that was created, new, is now extinguished, right? So money can be added into the system and it can leave the system when it's used to repay a bank debt, okay? There are additional ways. You didn't get off too easily here, sorry, Josh. There are additional ways. So we've got the debt in this hand. I'll just get you to face the audience here a little so they can see your pain. We have additional ways that debt is created without new money being created. So remember, when money, in fact, let's go back one thing here because this is actually important. If we go to here and we say that money is there's always an equal amount of debt somewhere in the system, as there is money, at least, that means if I then take this money over here and it ends up being in my pocket, so if you have 5 quid in your pocket right now, or 5 quid in a bank account, there has to be a debt somewhere else in the world. Has to be, mathematically. It's impossible for there not to be. The only way that there wouldn't be that debt is if this money came back and extinguished it. So all the money you have in your bank account, if you have any at all, is matched by a debt somewhere. But there's other ways that debt gets added to the system. The first is non-bank loans. Gilts, for example, in the UK, right? The equivalent of bonds in other parts of the world, where the government in particular, and sometimes corporations, will, you've got to go through the pain, yeah, it's it. You're doing a great job. Where the government often will say, we want to raise new money, right? We want to raise funds. We've got a fiscal shortage, etc. We want to raise new finance. And what do? They sell gilts often to the public or corporations, etc. But if I go and I buy a gilt, if that's what it's called here, I'm not from this part of the world, but I go and buy a gilt, I'm using existing money to buy that. I'm not a bank, I can't create money. That's why we have extra debt without extra new money in the system. And then we have the interest on this kind of debt and this kind of debt, those two forms of debt. So that leaves us with always much more debt than money in the system. Okay. Thank you for that. You're halfway through your job.
Okay.
All right. Now we come to the more important piece. What happens with money and debt in any capitalist system? Well, when a bank loans new money, and I'm going to need 2 volunteers here, and you will need to have strong arms for this one because you're going to get a little bit of a break. You get to be the elite in this experiment. Could I get 2 more volunteers? I think you were going to help me out before. Thank you. Anybody else willing to help me? I need 1 more person, please. Go on. Help me out. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Okay, so I'm going to continue being the bank. When a bank loans new money into existence, the money is used to purchase something, right? Like, that's the only reason that there's a loan in the first place. I'll just get you to move around so that the audience can see your beautiful face. Thank you. And then it separates. That money always separates, as we saw before, right? Josh bought something, and the money went somewhere, and the debt went elsewhere. So we're going to simulate that a little bit here. I'll go with the lighter books at the moment. So I'm the bank still, all right? And now I am going to, let's say that you're going to purchase something here. Josh is now going to represent the elite economy. I'm not going to explain what that is. I just want you to feel what I mean by that. And here is the real economy. The real economy is going to be represented, well, let's say the elite economy is representative of the world's wealthiest households and businesses. And here we have the real economy, which is the rest of us, and it's the world's majority of households, businesses, and all of the governments in the world as well. So I'm a bank, and you're going to purchase something on behalf of the real economy. Fantastic, he says that now. And so the money and the debt both enter the system. But, as we'll see a little bit later, the money is going to go over here to the elite economy. And Josh, you get a head start because that's how the elite economy works, especially in colonial ways. Up we go. And you're going to stand on it. Yeah, literally stand on it. All right. And now this money that is separated from someone who's purchased something probably from someone in the elite economy, right? Let's say you purchased something from a big box, like a big store that was owned by the elite largely. That money now goes in, and yes, you can stand on this, raising the height. There's the money, and here's the debt, okay? This is a common phenomenon that's happening, and we'll do the same here for you, sir. You might be a government that's... Oh, no, don't keep that money too long. Okay, we'll take the debt. Oh, you got a little higher there. All right, there we go. Now, I didn't tell you, you've got to hold your hands out with this so you feel the weight, the heaviness of that debt. All right, so we've already said here that the money, which is paid to someone, and the debt separate. But in any capitalist economy, the separation between those two, there's a growing amount that stays separated with money and debt, ensuring that more and more debts can never be repaid. What causes the permanent separation of money and debt? In any form of capitalism, where for-profit business is the norm, you have this siphoning effect, called the money siphon in the language that I use. And that siphoning is always stronger than the money pump, the way that money circulates in the real economy. The siphoning effect is always stronger than the pump. And I cannot tell you how many people around the world who I would say are paid to know better choose to ignore this phenomenon. What do I mean by the money siphon and how does it happen? Well, with the money siphon, money flows legally, right? There's also illegal ways and coercive ways that money flows in our global economy. But just focusing on the legal ways, money comes in here. And so let's say another thing gets purchased, yes? What happens is we see the flow back here to the elite economy in terms of dividends, right? So this could have been you purchased things that were with a joint stock corporation, for example, and the dividends flowed largely to the elite economy here, right? Or it could have been through the wages of this person who's the CEO within the businesses associated with this. We're talking in aggregates here, right? Could have been capital gains. This person sold something off in terms of shares, etc., and made a profit on that. Usually just selling things off amongst the elite economy largely. So there's all these ways. Interest on it could have been this person's owning part of the bank and taking the interest, right, through the ownership of the bank. There's all of these ways that the money flows, subsidies, and maintained by inheritance primarily in the legal senses. So you get a little bit more there, Josh. All right. Notice it's also going to get a little unstable here, which is an interesting phenomenon. Thank God, thank God. All right. Now, how do things go the other way? Because it's not just, this isn't the only phenomenon. There are ways that things circulate back into the real economy, right? So we have the money pump. With the money pump, money flows to the real economy largely via wages, right? So this person here representing the elite economy is paying some wages, so you get a little bit of that. But remember, you've got debts. So you might just be able to pay off a little bit of the debt this time, but it's not going to be long because of all the money siphoning that's happening, right? So don't get used to that. And philanthropy, right? So there's some flows that go back here with philanthropy, and other forms of welfare and reimbursement, insurance systems, etc. But you see, if we acknowledge all of these historical aspects, neo-colonial, from colonial, ableist, racist, sexist, lines against which this phenomenon runs, right? There's very much gendered aspects to this phenomenon we're describing. There's very much racial aspects to this phenomenon, historical aspects. In all of these, the accumulation is with certain households and companies. And that's the accumulation of money. And the accumulation of debt is with the rest, including governments around the world. Thank you all for this. I think that's it for now. Thank you. I didn't load you up too much. It was the first time I've done this experiment, so I'll work out how to be a little... You're debt-free. There you go. Thanks, sir. What we didn't say, and in fact I probably in future will keep the people up on the audience to give you a sense of what does the indebted do? What do you do if you're a household or you're a government or you're a business, whether it's a small business, a big business, you're over here and you're trying to get out of this dilemma? What's your primary option? We've got a range of different things. We've got things like people going, households having two members of the household, if there's a two-member household there, going into the workforce, for example, right? That's a phenomenon that tried to get out of this dilemma. We have all the way through to the tragedies of the 100,000 farmers in India suiciding because of extreme levels of debt, right? So there's lots of things, but what's the this is actually not a rhetorical question, so see if you can reflect on this for a moment. What's the primary thing you do if you're indebted here in order to get out of this situation? You take on another loan. Exactly. You go into more debt. There's no equitable, sustainable way out of this dynamic, mathematically or otherwise. It doesn't exist. Mostly, people take on more debt. That's right. This mathematics, right, this phenomenon which you might say, oh, it's oversimplified. Well, I've been studying this 20 years and I don't think it's oversimplified. I think this is pretty much how it happens, right? And you can feel it. People wonder why life is so difficult. We'll get to the specifics of that in just a moment here. But mathematically, total debt in the system always expands in any capitalist system, as does the ratio of debt to money. This is where we're at the moment, right? Global debt, global money. I just put these aren't specific graphs, but the numbers are as of today. 348 trillion in the global debt stock, and about, 144 trillion in the global money supply, right? Big difference in ratio. We just saw another $28 trillion in the last 6 months added to global debt, right? Because remember, this is compounding interest on all of these debts. This is baked into any form of capitalism. Why? Because if we go back to this dynamic that we had here earlier of the money siphon being stronger than the pump, imagine it wasn't. Imagine that money got siphoned and then it got returned just as much, right? In other words, I'm an entrepreneur, or an investor, etc. I get my profits and then I put all of that back in. Well, that's not capitalism anymore, right? Capitalism requires that ability for me to get a return on my investment. It's fundamental. It's the driver of most business activity. Not most businesses, and many small businesses around the world that aren't interested in constantly growing, but it's the dominant model in terms of our global economy. And this is the hidden growth imperative that underpins a growth-dependent economy. You see, I started the Post-Growth Institute 16 years ago, focused on the material throughput stuff, the environmental, can't have unlimited growth in a finite planet, right? That expression. That expression only goes so far to explaining the phenomenon that you're feeling in your body. Without looking at money and understanding this is what underpins it. So it's actually, we're talking about a growth dependency on the money supply always increasing and the debt stocks increasing even faster. That is the growth dependency that drives the accumulation of power, that drives the decision-making about the environment, the climate, consumption, who gets to tell you whether you're enough or you have enough, etc. These are the underpinnings, and what post-growth means for us at the Post-Growth Institute is moving beyond the dependency of an ever-expanding money supply and ever-expanding debt stocks in particular. Now, these phenomenon associated with this are familiar. I'm just going to show you one little example that might resonate. What happens, and you don't need to know economics. By the way, I'm a professor of economics and I've never studied economics in my life. I've not even sat in an economics class once in my life, and I've only read one economics book, and it was a philosophy book about economics. So this is designed for people who have no background in economics. That's me, right? I think you can get this with me, because if I can get it, you can definitely get it. And that is that when you've got all this money going into a space, right, it's being siphoned out of the real economy, and you've got limited assets, particularly productive assets, whether that's companies or things that you can invest in that aren't just non-fungible tokens or Bitcoin or some crap. When you've got this kind of accumulation of money in a space that's looking for a return on investment, what's going to happen to the prices of those assets over time? They're going to go up, right? Whenever you have more money in a space, if you're bidding for a house, for example, and there's 1,000 bidders versus one, you're going to get a higher price with 1,000, right? So it's just a simple principle. On the other side, so we always see prices overall, pick, whether it's housing, stocks, gold, it doesn't matter what your asset is of choice within different countries. Overall, assets inflate in price in this system. And what do you get on the other side? Because debt's accumulating with the real economy here, and there's not enough money coming back for people to get paid better. So what happens? You get downward pressure on wages. Assets inflate, wages go with downward pressure. Not always down, but downward pressure relative to the assets. That's why it's so freaking hard to buy a house all around the world, and getting harder. This economics is what drives global inequity, whether that's between countries, within communities, etc. So my conclusion here is that the creation of inequity is inherent to all forms of capitalism. There's no way to break this mathematics unless you're talking about something that isn't capitalism. By the way, this dynamic was actually also underpinning most forms of state socialism. You saw an accumulation of power in particular, but also accumulation of money that caused debt to accumulate elsewhere. And a self-preserving system in which inequity inherently grows can never be sustainable. In fact, I was just with Luke Kemp 2 days ago, who has just written a book called Goliath's Curse. Maybe he's coming down to give a talk, I believe. Yes, okay. And someone asked him, what's the overall takeaway from your book? It's probably the most comprehensive study of collapse across 300,000 years and 324 case studies. And he said, the number one consistency when you have collapse in any kind of system is inequity. Right? And we have here the spirit level Kate and Richard, who really unpacked the importance of equity and equitability within societies for a whole range of indicators. But I'm telling you here that inequity is baked into capitalism, which you might have already felt, you might have already said, you might have already known, but did you realize how it's baked in? with this piece around money and debt. What are some of the ways to get out of this proposed mess? Well, this is where things get interesting and where I might step on some toes. Because the majority, well, let's have a look first before I make an assessment. Here are some of the things that I see as proposed alternatives that cut across the political spectrum, by the way. So I'm going to move probably from further right politically to further left as we go through this list. Let's extract more and consume more. Let's grow faster. That's how we get out of this mess, right? It's grow faster. Hopefully that one's clear that just accelerates this phenomenon that was here. But we'll get to that in a second too. Privatize more. Finance more with private financing. I'm not going to unpack these so much as just to go through the work harder or work less. You get proposals on both sides as a way to address these dynamics. Increase productivity. Better innovation, automation, efficiency, AI, blockchain, right? These are another proposals we see. Public financing, MMT, modern monetary theory, probably some fans in the room here. Monetary reform, right? Change the money system. I'm thinking of my dear friends at Positive Money, for example. Like, there's lots of spaces where these kinds of things come through. Local alternative cryptocurrencies. I'm definitely a fan of local currencies. And they are some of the proposed alternatives that we see in this space. A commitment to environmental, social governance, ESG, or the COP process, the Council of Parties, right? The environmental pieces, or Green New Deals, or renewable transitions, right? We've got to focus on renewables as a way out of this dilemma, right? The energy is what this is all about. I disagree. I think money sits underneath energy in ways that isn't often explored. We can increase regulation. We can do big taxes, right? Some of the biggest work in this space, Piketty and otherwise, is about putting a big tax on the wealthiest. It's very popular amongst leftist spaces. Big wealth tax, big carbon tax, these sorts of things. Financial transaction tax. Living wages. I imagine there's plenty of people here who are big fans of living wages. I'll get to this in just a second, the case I'm making. Upper wealth limits, limitarianism. Right? Luke was proposing, for example, no one should have more than 10 million quid. More philanthropy, debt forgiveness. These are things that some of you would be familiar with more than others, right? Debt jubilees. Unionization, nationalization, forcible wealth redistribution, revolution. Let's not stop there. Let's blame, shame, and eat the rich. Or let's hope, pray, transcend, or tell a new story. Here's my question to you. Do any of these proposals fundamentally challenge the dynamic of the money siphon being stronger than the money pump? I don't think they do. I want to give you an example of what happened with the debt jubilee in 2000. Anybody remember the debt jubilee? Okay. For those who didn't, you had a whole lot of heavily indebted nations around the world, and then a campaign led out of the UK that involved the churches ultimately, that drew on this concept of debt forgiveness, right? And we saw a situation where these countries had their debt forgiven. Now, if you and I hear the words debt forgiveness, my sense is, from talking to a lot of people, that you'll have the same understanding that I had years back, which is, oh, the debt just got wiped out. But remember, early on, the only way really to distinguish a debt in a market system is for money to extinguish that debt. So what happened? Oh my gosh, what happened? They set up, through the United Nations, a fund. Governments, largely in the global north, then had to, if they were fiscally, if they had a net balance, like they were running deficits, they had to sell gilts to make the money to put into the fund, right? So governments had to go into more debt in the global north to put money into the fund. And then what happened with the money in the fund? It went to all of the elites who owned the debt that was never going to get paid off anyway. So debt jubilee, in my assessment, resulted in the rich getting richer. even if the debts were wiped out, but they were odious anyway. This phenomenon, if you actually investigate what happens here, you discover that things even like debt jubilees don't change the phenomenon of the money siphon and the money pump, and the siphon being stronger than the pump. They sound great in theory, but in practicality, if we look at the approaches of the political right, for example, I'm using that term quite loosely, those approaches that we're familiar with, neoliberal approaches, for example, privatization, etc., accelerates the speed of the money siphon, reinforcing it in plain sight. We're seeing this right now in the US, right? Deregulate this, subsidize all sorts of things that are about lining certain people's pockets. It's very much in plain sight. But get this, on the left, they decelerate the speed, all those things that we saw before, right? Redistribution, etc. It does decelerate the speed of the money siphon, but it reinforces it in hidden ways. It doesn't challenge capitalism. In fact, if the UK really surged back to a welfare state, but it was still capitalistic, you'd still have debt expanding. It would just be expanding more slowly, more hidden. The number of people that I talk to that don't realize that the Scandinavian nations that so often get put up on a pedestal in terms of levels of equality, and there's good reasons for some of that adoration. If you look at the data in terms of inequality, and of course there's also international interrelationships that are important here because I'm talking about in the aggregate, but even, for example, Denmark has an election, I think, this weekend. Number one issue, cost of living, rising inequality. It's just going slower there because they've got more of the assets, public housing, these sorts of things, that have been slowing down this trend that happens in any form of capitalism. So you have to move beyond on both the right and the left in this. And this is a real reckoning for the left because most of the things that I see put forward are about redistributing wealth. I'm not saying stop redistributing wealth. I'm saying don't see that as the be-all and end-all. It can't be. It's not going to get us to a system beyond capitalism, and you're going to see debt continue to expand in the aggregate no matter how much we redistribute, which means extra pressure, more accumulation of money, more inequity, and the onward trudge towards collapse. To have money permanently flow within the real economy, you need a system based on pre-distribution, right? What you drew before, a system that was inherently circular in ways, non-linear. It has to be baked in, not an afterthought, not just redistribution. That's why for us at the Post-Growth Institute, post-growth means moving beyond capitalism. And only in such a system can we have the spaciousness. What I'm about to present in the next part about post-capitalism isn't the be-all and end-all. It's not a fixed state. It's just a system that I think we can get to, perhaps not in my lifetime, but at some point that gives spaciousness to explore in less fundamentally compromised ways what enough feels and looks like. Because right now, it's very hard to have the space to feel what enough looks like with all of the pressures to consume, and more than the pressures to consume, the pressures, if you're indebted, to survive, right? There's not, the luxury, even to be in this lecture space is not a common luxury around the world. How can we get to a system in which money doesn't linearly accumulate? Well, I believe there's two prongs to this, and I'm going to focus on the second tonight. In other work that we do at the Institute, we look at the first in terms of practical experiences through things like our offers and needs market process. How do you decommodify? How do you take back your economy to the local, to the neighborhood level, etc.? How do you take things out of the monetary space? It's as simple as, for example, if you and I are exchanging services and we're not charging for each of those, or we're charging in bartered ways, we've now decommodified something that would have otherwise been part of the formal market economy. But tonight I'm going to focus on this other part, which is, I think we outcompete capitalism. What do I mean by that? Here we go. Post-capitalist alternatives, outcompeting capitalism. Some businesses actually drive the money pump more than they drive the money siphon, even if they operate in a capitalist system. Here's a graph that I created with my co-author Jen Hinton, where we look at what's the primary motive of a business and then what's the model of business ownership. Right? We're going to look here at the primary purpose being purpose itself versus profit, and 4 different models. Absent, which means very removed, like a shareholder that has no relationship to the thing that they are owning, all the way through to no ownership. Listed corporations, we're familiar with those. Triple bottom line companies put a little bit more of purpose into things, but are still absent ownership most of the time. Small businesses, a lot more purpose. They're individually owned. We're getting through here to sole proprietorships, employee-owned or worker-owned businesses, and then not-for-profit businesses. This is an engineering company that I was introduced to in 2009 in Queensland at an event where the keynote speaker, Colin Saltmere, got up and described his engineering company, these folks, and talked about the civil engineering work that they did, construction, surveying of different kinds, welcome. And he then said these 5 words about this business that had a $17 million turnover and 50 employees. He said these 5 words that changed the course of my life. He said, "We are not for profit." I, up until that point, had not considered the possibility that an engineering company could be not for profit. So I went up to him afterwards and said, "Colin, what are you saying? What do you mean you're not for profit?" He said, "Well, us Aboriginal mob, when we set up this entity, we don't believe in the idea of profit maximising or accumulation. We all loaned some startup capital into the business. We set it up under a not-for-profit structure. It was a community association in Australia. And then, after it did well, they were able to repay the loans, and then the business was entirely owned by itself. It was not for profit." This set me off on a journey that was so fascinating over the last, 25 years or 15 years, I can't keep track, however many years, because I discovered that I'd been working for not-for-profit businesses all my life. And I also discovered that there wasn't a field in which there wasn't a not-for-profit business. There wasn't any industry in the world. Here's an example. This is Bangladesh's largest lifestyle brand. They have about 70,000 now, actually, from what I understand, artisans who are contributing, making products, etc., for these stores. It's called Arong. This is the name of the business that is in different parts of Bangladesh. All of Arong's profits circulate back into the real economy. Why? Because it's a business that's run by one of the world's biggest non-government organisations. Does anybody know the name of this business? Isn't that interesting? It's BRAC. BRAC has 126 million beneficiaries annually, 100,000 plus employees, so about the same as Microsoft, 1.2 billion in income. It works in healthcare, education, predominantly. What percentage of BRAC's income, the 1.2 billion, do you think comes as a non-profit organisation, as an NGO? What percentage of it comes from philanthropy? All right, donations, people on the corner signing you up to support its work, governments pledging money, big philanthropic organisations backing it. Only 14%. 86% of BRAC's $1.2 billion of revenue comes from running businesses. Bakeries, craft stores, banks, artificial insemination units. It has all sorts of business activities. It was set up that way. Here's a question for you. We've got about 59 million people in the UK who are banked, as in they have a bank account that they use once a year, at least. What percentage of people in the UK do you think, and this is a question for you all, I'm going to ask for people to shout things out, but I'm going to give you 5 seconds of silence to reflect on your answer. I would love everybody to have an answer for this. What percentage of people do you think in the UK bank with a not-for-profit bank? And by that I mean a bank that has no private individual equity ownership. Just take 5 seconds in silence. Let's hear for some people. What percentage? 10%. Ooh, that's a lot. It's a lot of people. So that would be 5.9 million people. Anybody else?
I'll raise you down to 5.
5, okay. Now we're heading in that direction. Anybody else? 1.2. 0. Well, it's 47%. 28 million people in the UK have a bank account with either a building association. Nationwide has, 16 million members? Hands up if you bank with Nationwide. You're all banking with a not-for-profit, okay? What do I mean by that? It means that the profits go back. There's no private individual equity owners of Nationwide. Look at how powerful that not-for-profit was when it bought out Virgin Money, right? Brought a lot of... Anyone was banking with Virgin Money before that? All of a sudden, you were banking... Now you're under a not-for-profit structure. Amazing, right? Very different, right? Virgin Money was a for-profit business before that. Bought out by a not-for-profit. Right, so you've got about 2% coming from credit unions, 2.5%, and the remaining 44.5% coming from different building societies, building associations. Now here's the thing, this is research I did a long time ago, I need to update it a little bit, but almost 20% from my calculations of global GDP comes from not-for-profit forms of business. There are 4 different kinds. You have foundation-owned businesses or industrial foundations like Patagonia, right, where the foundation owns the business. At the risk of people going into but they're not sustainable, oh gosh, I can't believe that you're telling me they're an example that you're including about post-growth and post-capitalism, I'm going to take a risk and tell you some other businesses that are not-for-profit that you probably had no idea were not-for-profit. Remember, before I say these businesses operate in a for-profit world. So if you hear what I'm about to say and go, that's not sustainable, we're talking about getting to the core of monetary flows being the way out of this dilemma. Not what we've been taught, which is about environmental and consumption. That's downstream. So here we go. Some other not-for-profit businesses that are foundation-owned. Bosch. Some of you got Bosch in your kitchen, right? Not-for-profit. IKEA. IKEA is not-for-profit. Interesting. I'll stop there, actually. Consumer cooperatives. You've got plenty of them in the UK. Here's Nissei from Japan, the largest life insurance company in Japan. Not-for-profit. In fact, about 27% of global insurance is not-for-profit, mutual, right? Where, again, there's no private individual owners. The policies and all of the pieces are worked out in ratios, apart from people's salaries, to just ensure that it can continue in providing insurance for its members. State-owned enterprises. Here's a profitable one, Indian Railways. Very profitable, actually. Lots of government enterprises throughout the world are profitable. In fact, and I'm putting aside the ethics and different beliefs that we might have about what I'm about to say for a moment, the reason that people in Saudi Arabia don't pay income tax is because Saudi Aramco is 98.5% state-owned, right? That's a phenomenon that people often don't like, imagine energy in the UK was actually state-owned, what the impact that would be in terms of filling the coffers of government, reducing your price at the pump, etc., all of these things, the ability to move faster to renewables in terms of not having that political capture that happens from for-profit interests, etc. And then we have here the last, which is non-profit businesses, like the YMCA, across 120 countries. I'm sure some of you would be familiar, runs business models here in all sorts of, in terms of employment, in terms of health, centres that you can visit, etc. These are just examples. There are so many examples. Mozilla Firefox, not-for-profit. Barcelona Football Club, consumer cooperative. Interesting. You might go, whoa, but they pay so much to the players. That's because they're part of a for-profit system. But if you're a member of Barca or Real Madrid, you can go vote. You've got your membership, etc. And the profits are going back in. That's why they actually have such amazing feeder programs, because they're able to reinvest so much compared to Man U, for example. Now, if I was just talking to you here about these models in some pie-in-the-sky kind of way, I would tell myself to sit down. Why am I so interested in a system beyond capitalism? And why do I think it's possible? Perhaps not in my lifetime, but at some point, because of this. Because the advantages of certain business models, if we go all the way back here, my theory, and it's backed by the research that I've found so far, not cherry picking, just really looking at the research, suggests that competitive advantage, because you have different businesses that compete with each other all the time, competitive advantage is shifting from this side in this direction globally, different in different times and different places. For example, if we just look at the building associations here, right, with Nationwide, the growth in the mortgage sector, the percentage of the mortgages that Nationwide has been taking is phenomenal growth. In part, I would suggest, just like with Bosch and why they're double the industry level of R&D budget, because they've got those extra money that's not going out to shareholders, that's not paying necessarily income tax, depending on which country you're in, where non-profits get income tax exemption, etc. All these advantages, the ability to engage volunteers. Mozilla Firefox has more than 10,000 volunteers around the world because it's able to market itself as a not-for-profit, and people are willing to engage versus if you're going to volunteer for Google, right? Very different value proposition. The ability to engage with grants for lots of small-scale not-for-profit. The majority of the world's not-for-profits are not ones that I put up here. They're small-scale. CICs in the UK, right? So many CICs that are limited by guarantee versus limited by shares, the not-for-profit version. So I believe that we're seeing competitive advantage shift, and I think especially with things like war, oil crises, etc., you're going to get more competitive advantage shifting over to the small, the local, the relational, etc. My claim is that in a market economy where the primary model of business was not-for-profit, right? Not every model, but as in you couldn't start a business in an incorporated way as a for-profit, you'd be out-competed by a not-for-profit or a small business that maybe has less allegiance to profit anyway. What happens when we looked at this was all, and I mean all, of the problematic aspects associated with capitalism were reversed or made benevolent. So, for example, compound interest on loans. Horrific for those who are heavily indebted, right? Your debt just keeps going up faster and faster and faster. When you have money circulating inherently in an economy, compound interest is a really good incentive to maintain trust, right? Like to actually, the original idea, which was if you hold on longer, you need to have some kind of reminder to get that payment over here to keep the money circulating. Otherwise, you're going to have this, you're going to be contributing to this accumulation of debt and money elsewhere. Limited liability. There's this big one in the US. So many people are fighting corporate personhood. Maybe you've heard that. Citizens United. This. Now, I get why, but what they don't realize is that corporations need to have personhood, because otherwise, non-profits, and I'm assuming the University of York is a non-profit, I'm imagining. Any idea on that? Not sure. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Right? So if it was, let's say it is, if it wasn't able to have corporate personhood, it couldn't own these assets. Right? So these things that are problematic in capitalism become important in a post-capitalist future. The ability for incorporated entities to hold assets and trade assets, etc. There's a lot more there. I'll say it has appeal, this model, across left and right. Why? Because we're actually talking about, and this might rub a few people the wrong way, but just bear with me. We're talking about, in fact, I'll tell you a little story to explain this better. I showed up to an event in the US about 10 years ago. I was totally thrown into, like, under the bus because this person who had invited me was very politically left, and I had no idea that the audience that I was going to go into was entirely right. There was 26 men in the room. This woman had invited me in. I got there 15 minutes early thinking I'll, have a little bit of time to settle in. I walked in the door of this building, the U Club they called it. I walked in and some guy sitting down over here goes, "Here's the fucking communist." And I was like, and so I walked back out. So I walked in and I sat down next to, crouched down next to him. I talked about guns, I talked about religion, I talked about family. I just went full conservative values, anything I could think of, right? Went around to every single person before we started. But then we were back in the hotspot because the person who was introducing me said, "And now here's Donnie to talk about post-capitalism." And it's like, oh God, right. So I get up, having done a little bit of prep work with these folks, and I said, I'm interested in entrepreneurialism, innovation, smaller government, and increased service provision. And I'm going to show you how all of those are more possible in a post-capitalist future than right now. There was putty in my hands. They were like so intrigued that you could have that someone talking about post-capitalism would talk about smaller government. That's about as far from left-wing ideology as it gets, right? So this is where there's possibilities here, because if you realize our system is built on incredible inefficiencies. For-profit companies largely create all these problems. They then pay some taxes to governments and philanthropy and others support these not-for-profits that were set up to fix the problems that were over here. It's hugely inefficient. Just merge these two here, make the businesses and the not-for-profits come together so that every business is driven by purpose, which is going to reduce a lot of those externalities. And then you've got all sorts of efficiencies that mean you need less shit getting stirred around. It's so inefficient to have this model of the third sector to mop up the things that the for-profit market creates. It's hugely inefficient. Just do what BRAC does and run the businesses that cross-subsidize the social services within-house. Then you also get to understand the difference between running the business and the social services is not necessarily that big a difference. There's similar customers, similar people, similar learnings across both of those things. We're running short on time. You can learn more, by the way, about that. We've got a draft book, which has been in draft for 10 years, but it's there. You can find out a bit more if you'd like to read some of the details. What I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure you didn't leave without an idea of what I think you can do if you're interested in this kind of stuff. There's 8 things that I think you can do. It's howonearth.us. Here are the leverage points. And a little note first. I'm getting a little bolder as I go on with this talk, so my language is going to start to loosen up a little bit. I think that a lot of activists have done us a disservice by playing to this idea that is true, that neoliberalism pushed a whole lot of people into this idea of individual actions, and that we should reject that because it's a systems problem, right? The changing the light bulb, these sorts of things, was an industry campaign to put the focus back on individual action. I agree, but I think it does us a disservice because I think there are ways we can individually act that affect systems change. That's what I want to take you through. The first thing is what we've been talking about tonight is this idea of focusing on pre-distribution. Walk out of this door, go out to, some place in the city or the town or wherever, and see if you can start to work out which businesses are pre-distributing, that have profits that circulate inherently because of their business model. I did this 2 nights ago in Edinburgh. I was walking with someone. I was saying, "Oh, did you know that's a not-for-profit?" They're like, "No, I didn't." I said, I don't know what that one is. Maybe, John Lewis, it's a worker call. All right. So I was looking at things through the lens of ownership structure, which is not written on the front of businesses, very rarely. But it is on their websites, or it is in their bylaws, or it is in the certain registries. The more you can learn about which businesses are pre-distributing versus for-profit, the more power you have with regards to the things I'm about to say. The second thing, and I would say this is the most powerful action you could take today, is to move your banking to a not-for-profit institution. Why is this so powerful? It's not just the obvious, it's this. If I have £5 in my account, okay, and some guy with an Australian accent comes in front of me and says, move your money to a not-for-profit institution, I'm going to say, I've got £5, mate. What's the point? And I'll say, there's a big point, because you're not just moving £5 from a for-profit institution to a not-for-profit. With the way that capital reserve ratios work and the ability for banks to lend more than they hold, right? Because they're not lending the actual money they hold, they're just creating new entries, but they have to have a ratio in different countries of how much they're storing in reserve, just in case everybody comes in and wants their money out of the bank one day, right? So they have to have that amount held in some place, in a central bank or otherwise. So when you move £5 in the UK, you might be moving the equivalent of £35 that could be lent by the for-profit over to £35 here, and now you've got a £70 transaction with £5. It's very powerful. In fact, a person named Kristen Christian in 2011 in Los Angeles got so frustrated with her bank, Wells Fargo, gouging her with her low balance with like a $20 fee every month. They put up a post on Facebook and they said, I'm moving my money to a credit union. There was no campaign or anything. And as a result of that, 500,000 people moved around $4 to $6 billion. 1% of overall equity shifted from for-profit to not-for-profit in the US just because of a Facebook campaign. We saw the Move Your Money campaign about 12 years ago in the UK. I don't know why it died. We need it back. Not just choose an ethical bank, move your money to a not-for-profit. It's really, really critical. It's very powerful. Move your patronage, where you're purchasing. Go small, go local, go not-for-profit, or alternatives. Take it out of the formal market economy. I'm going to move through quickly here so that we have a chance to just reflect for a moment here. If you've got investments, well, guess what? You can actually loan to not-for-profits. There's lots of ways. You can talk to me about that afterwards if interested. I'm going up to Findhorn and Eco Village in the next few days. There was an opportunity last year for people, anyone in the public in the UK, to loan money to an eco village. It's a not-for-profit. You got a return on that investment. It's not massive, but it's purpose-driven. Move your labour, whether that's voluntarily or otherwise. Go to non-profits and ask them, what's your business model? So that we're helping them also wean off the dependency on philanthropy. I'm talking about not-for-profit businesses tonight, not non-profits that are traditionally charity dependent, just to make the distinction here. If you're an entrepreneur, think about setting up as a not-for-profit or transitioning or doing an exit to community, as they're called. Lots of powerful ways. Most people, if we want to talk about this privately afterwards, there are so many more ways that you can get startup investment as a not-for-profit than people realize. It just has to be debt, not equity. And if you've got a not-for-profit, as I touched on earlier, why not see if you can generate more revenue? Our organisation is primarily philanthropically supported, but we've got a 10-year plan that we're working on to expand our consulting, our workshops, our training, so that that becomes the majority of the income that we're generating. And then finally, move your advocacy. There's, for example, I was in Scotland yesterday, as mentioned, Community Wealth Building Act that has just been passed. Wonderful example that supports a lot of these kinds of things. See if you can be part of getting different legal and ownership structures into business curriculum within universities, in high schools, etc. I remember years back in Australia, they managed, after some lobbying from the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals, to get on, I think it was business.gov.au, the main website you go to if you want to start a business. They managed to get on the front page cooperatives as an example that was previously not there, right? These ways to seed through advocacy, different pathways, because when I talk to entrepreneurs all around the world, they've most of the time got no idea about not-for-profit business. Never heard of it. And this is even, I've talked to billionaires who didn't know that there was a not-for-profit business, or that some of the businesses they're competing with are not-for-profit. That's it, folks. You have agency to help us move to what many of you drew first, right? The linear capitalist economy, to a full circle post-capitalist, post-growth economy, to a thriving future that our bodies know. Remember, our bodies know this. Our bodies know that the circulation has to be built in, and we can get there. We can get to that future if we're very targeted and a little more strategic with where we put our emphasis as activists, as entrepreneurs, as researchers, etc. Thank you.